The light was wrong. Not the color of it, though that was wrong too. A pale, surgical violet that made his skin look like something already dead. It was the angle. Mounted flush in the ceiling, directly overhead, so there were no shadows to hide in and no way to avoid the interrogator's eyes, without staring at the floor. Calder Mace had been sitting in the metal chair for 40 minutes. He knew because he'd been counting his own heartbeats since they brought him in, and his resting rate was 62. The Vetri officer across the table hadn't blinked in that entire time. Her species didn't need to. 3 horizontal pupils tracked him independently, one on his hands, one on his mouth, one fixed on a point just left of his forehead, where she apparently believed humans kept their deceit. The Vethri called it the Kess fold. They were wrong about the anatomy. Calder wasn't going to correct her. Cadet Mace, she said. Her vocal cords produced sound in triplicate, slightly offset tones that made every sentence feel like a chord. You were enrolled in Tier Null of the Edric Sovereignty Combat Skolum, teen standard days ago. In that time, you have been the subject of 9 formal conduct complaints, 4 training loss disputes, structural damage claim, and a taxonomic reclassification request filed by the Dean of Species Assessment. She paused. Calder said nothing. The reclassification request, she continued, asks that humans be moved from developmental category 6, social cooperative, moderate threat, to category 2. What's category 2? Calder asked. He already knew. Strategic apex predator. All 3 pupils aligned on him for the first time. Reserved for species that hunt with planning, deception, and coordinated sacrifice. 4 species in category 2 across the known galaxy. The reclassification would make humanity the 5th. Because of me, because of you. She set a tablet flat on the table between them. This debrief will determine whether the request is justified, or whether you are simply an outlier. Your species will never replicate. Tell me what happened, starting from arrival. Calder looked at the tablet, at the recording light pulsing soft amber on its edge, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of the past 2 weeks settle across his shoulders like ballast. Then he sat forward, rested his forearms on the cold surface, and began. The shuttle that brought him to the Skolum was a repurposed cargo hauler. No viewports, no seats, just anchor straps bolted into the bulkhead, at intervals designed for bodies much taller than his. Calder was 17, lean, 160 centimeters, which made him the smallest sentient being to enter the Edric Sovereignty's premier military training facility in its 300-year history. The admissions officer who processed him, a Torcon with 4 arms and skin like cracked riverbed clay, had to look up his species in a reference index, scrolling past entries for fauna, parasites, and regional pests before finding the provisional membership file buried in a diplomatic annex. Humans had only been granted provisional sovereignty membership 9 months earlier. The vote had been contentious. Calder was the first human to apply to the Skolum. The admissions board approved it on a technicality. The charter didn't explicitly prohibit developmental category species, and denying it would have created a diplomatic incident nobody wanted to manage. So they let him in, and they waited for him to fail. He was also the only candidate in his intake cycle to arrive without a sponsor, without a family military lineage, without a government backing his enrollment, and without a single augmentation. The Vethri cadets had neural lattice implants that let them share tactical data in real time. Entire squad-level awareness compressed into a shared consciousness stream. The Kessori had subdermal armor plating grown into their hides during adolescence. Biological shields that could stop a blade and absorb blunt trauma that would cave in a human skull. Khan could lock their joints into structural rigidity, turning their own bodies into barricades. A living wall of bone and cartilage that no projectile short of a plasma bolt could breach. The Celerin, the smallest non-human species in the cohort, still outweighed Calder by 30 kilograms, and had a secondary neural cluster in their abdomens that processed spatial data independent of conscious thought. Calder had a brain that ran on glucose and a skeleton made of calcium. The admissions officer typed his species designation into the system, and the field auto-populated as UNCH, unclassified. The dash was supposed to be a species subtype. They hadn't assigned one. They gave him a bunk in Barracks 9, the overflow wing, where the intake rejects traditionally washed out within the first cycle. His mattress was a thermal pad calibrated for Kisori body temperature, 20 degrees too warm for human comfort. The ceiling was 4 meters up. The door controls were mounted at Torkon's shoulder height, which meant he had to jump to reach them. He stowed his kit, one standard pack, personal effects, and walked to the orientation hall 30 minutes early. The hall was vast, a curved amphitheater cut from living stone, its walls veined with bioluminescent mineral deposits that pulsed faintly in the Skolam's omnipresent violet light. The seats were scaled for average sovereignty physiology, deep-set, broad-backed, with armrests positioned for limbs twice his length. He climbed into one near the front and sat with his boots 6 inches off the floor. The other cadets filtered in over the next half hour. Most of them ignored him the way you ignore a piece of furniture that doesn't fit the room. A few stared, brief, cataloging glances, the kind you give something you're trying to place on the threat spectrum and can't. 1. A Kasori male a full meter taller than Calder, his hide mottled green-black, the subdermal plates along his forearms, raised like river stones under leather, stopped at the end of Calder's row and made a sound his translator rendered as amused contempt. "You're the Terran. Not a question." "I'm the human," Calder said. "Your admissions file says you have no tactical augments, no lattice, no plating, no secondary systems, and a skeletal density 2/3 of the minimum standard. Your cardiovascular endurance is listed as Class 4, the same as prey species on 3, sovereignty worlds. That's all accurate." The Kasori leaned in. His breath smelled like copper and wet chalk. "First combat exercise is in 72 hours, full contact. My name is Tor Dakin, and I have killed in sparring before. Accidents happen with underdeveloped species." Calder looked up at him. Up close, the subdermal plates shifted under the Kasori's hide like tectonic plates. Autonomous, reflexive, positioning to protect whatever his nervous system perceived as the current threat axis. 72 hours, Calder said. "Thanks for the heads up." Dawkins searched his face for something, fear, bravado, defiance, and didn't seem to find it. He moved on. Calder let out a slow breath and went back to studying the room. He noted the exits, the sight lines from the instructor's platform to every seat, the structural supports that would provide cover if the hall ever needed to serve as a defensive position. Habit. The kind of habit you developed on a world where paying attention was the difference between eating and being eaten. The orientation briefing was delivered by Commandant Louvel, a Vethray career officer with rank scarring etched in pale silver lines across both temples. She stood on the central platform with her hands clasped behind her back and spoke without notes. "You are here because your governments, your families, or your own delusions convinced you that you belong in the most demanding military institution in the sovereignty. 60% of you will wash out before the first review cycle. There are no allowances for species-specific limitations. There is no modified curriculum. There is no remedial track. There is only the standard, and it does not care what you are." She swept her gaze across the amphitheater. When it landed on Calder, it held for 2 full seconds. Calder heard what she didn't say. The standard had never been for survivable for a human. Every officer in this room was waiting for him to prove them right. Not with malice, with the calm certainty of professionals who had already calculated the outcome. The first 72 hours were administrative. The armor they issued him was a Torkon cadet's chest piece cut down and restrapped, and it still hung off his shoulders like a poncho on a fence post. The pulse carbine had a grip designed for 4-fingered hands, 2 sizes larger than his. He spent an hour that first night wrapping it with strips from his mattress thermal pad until it fit his palm. Nobody offered to help. He was simply beneath notice. He ate in the refectory, where the standard ration was a protein-dense block, calibrated for sovereignty metabolisms. High mineral content, complex carbohydrate chains his gut couldn't fully process, and a flavor profile his translator helpfully described as nutritionally adequate. It tasted like salted chalk and gave him cramps for 2 days, until his digestive system adapted. By day 3, he'd learned to soak the blocks in water for 10 minutes. It didn't improve the taste, but it made the texture less like concrete. He slept 5 hours a night. Not because he chose to, but because the barracks lighting cycled on a 21-hour rotation keyed to the Vethrai, circadian rhythm, and his body couldn't sync to it. He used the extra waking hours to walk Willem's corridors, mapping them. Exit points, choke points, sight lines, structural load paths, ventilation conduits wide enough for a human and too narrow for anyone else. He noted which doors were blast-rated and which were standard. He counted steps between intersections. He timed the guard rotations at the armory. He found 3 maintenance conduits that didn't appear on any posted schematic. Nobody paid attention. He was small, quiet, hopelessly out of his depth. The first combat exercise landed on day 4. They called it the Forge. 30 cadets, 6 squads, dropped into a multi-level simulation environment with live kinetic rounds. Reduced lethality, but enough to break bones and rupture soft tissue. Pain was data, the instructor said. Learn from it or wash out. Calder's squad drew him by default. Nobody picked the human. The squad leader, a Vethrai female named Keth, assigned him rear guard, the position farthest from contact, traditionally given to the weakest link. Stay behind us, she told him. Don't fire unless fired on. Don't advance. Don't engage. If you get hit, fall and wait for extraction. Do you understand? Understood, Calder said. He checked his modified pulse carbine and didn't argue. The Forge dropped them into a labyrinth of interconnected chambers and elevated walkways. Walls of gray composite, lighting set to emergency amber, gravity set to 1.3 standard. Close enough to Earth's pull that Calder felt almost normal while the Vethrai struggled and the Kisori slowed. Keth pushed the squad forward in a standard sovereignty wedge formation. Textbook. Predictable. Every other squad was running the same formation because 3 centuries of doctrine said it worked. Until it didn't. Calder didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes. He held his position and listened. Most cadets relied on tactical overlays, lattice feeds, augmented senses. Calder relied on his ears. 2 million years of evolution on a savanna, where the rustle of grass could mean dinner or death had given his species. An auditory processing system that most sovereignty species couldn't match, not in raw sensitivity, but in pattern discrimination. He heard the difference between footsteps on metal and footsteps on composite. He could hear the scrape of subdermal plates against a railing and calculate the species, the distance, and the direction. He heard the ambush setting up before it happened. Kisori plates scraping 2 levels above. A squad moving through a side corridor on his left. 3rd squad positioning behind them, cutting off their retreat. He keyed his squad comm. Contact above, 40 degrees right. 2nd squad flanking from corridor 7. 3rd element behind us, 60 meters closing. They'll pin us at the junction in under a minute. Keth didn't respond for 3 seconds. Then, rear guard, hold position. If we hold here, we're boxed. 3 squads coordinating. Take the team left. Down the maintenance shaft at junction 4. I'll draw the pin squad east. That is not standard formation protocol. They know the standard formation. That's why they're already set up for it. You've got 40 seconds. Another pause. Keth's voice came back tight, professionally clipped. You have 60 seconds. Calder broke from the squad and moved. Doors, designed for Torkon's shoulders, gave him room to sprint. He put 3 rounds into the ceiling above the ambush position. Ricochets that rained debris down on the upper squad, who flinched for exactly the 2 seconds Keth needed to pull her people into the shaft. The pin squad found an empty corridor. By the time they reoriented, Calder had moved through a ventilation duct too narrow for any species with plating down 2 levels and into a flanking position behind a squad that didn't know he was there. He watched them for 12 seconds, mapped their spacing, identified the 2 with the slowest reaction times. He put them both down in 3 seconds. Shots to the lower back, below the armor line, where every species had vulnerable nerve clusters. The remaining 3 turned. Turning takes time when your overlay says the threat is in front and your ears say it's behind. He dropped 2 more before they completed their rotation. The 5th managed to raise her weapon. Calder was already moving, put a round through the gap in her shoulder guard from 3 meters. The Forge lasted another 14 minutes. Keth's squad took the central objective. The Proctor, a scarred Torkon weapons instructor named Drevin, missing 2 of his 4 arms from service injuries, reviewed the engagement data in silence for a long time. Squad 9. Unconventional tactics. Unauthorized solo engagement. Deviation from standard formation protocol. He looked at Calder. The human rear guard accounted for 11 of your squad's 14 eliminations. Solo, in a team exercise. Noted, Drevin said, and marked something in a field labeled Escalation Protocol. That night, Tor Dakin found Calder in the refectory. The Kasori sat down across from him without asking. 11 kills. Reduced lethality. If those rounds had been live, 11 cadets would be in the morgue. You moved through that environment like you'd been hunting in it for years. I moved through it the way my species moves through any terrain. It's not special, it's what we do. Dawkins' plates rippled, a threat display involuntary, but his voice was quiet. You're going to draw attention. The Crucible. Solo survival. Live threat environment. No support, no extraction until you complete the objective or you fail. It's designed for cadets who've trained for 2 standard years. And nobody survives it early. They use it to break the ones who stand out too fast. It's not a reward, it's a diagnostic tool. They want to see where you crack. Calder looked at the Kasori across from him. The armored hide, the predator's pupils, the mass that could crush him in a grapple, and recognized something in his posture. Not hostility, warning. The kind of warning one soldier gave another when they'd seen what was coming. Then I won't stand out, Calder said. You already did. The next 8 days proved Tor Dakin right. Calder didn't try to stand out. He tried to survive. But survival in the Skolum meant performing, and performing at any level above immediate failure meant the instructors noticed. And when the instructors noticed, the difficulty calibrated upward. In the tactics seminar, Commandant Seal, a Vethrai strategist whose rank scars were thin and numerous, posed a scenario. A defended position, 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage, no air support, limited ammunition, open terrain. Every cadet ran the numbers. The Vethrai linked their lattices and modeled 73 variations in real time. The answers came back the same. Retreat and regroup. Hold and attrit. Standard doctrine. Calder raised his hand. You could win it in 40 minutes. Sale's 3 pupils tracked him. Explain. The defenders have numerical advantage, but they're in a fixed position. Fixed means committed. Committed means predictable. You send one element in a feint against the strongest point, not to win, to make them commit reserves. While they're repositioning, your main effort through the weakest section of their line. But you don't stop to hold ground. You push through, loop behind, and hit the reserves in the open while they're transitioning. They're facing 2 directions. The defenders on the line can't fire without hitting their own people. You collapse their entire structure from the inside. 40 minutes. The room was quiet. Sale studied him. That requires your feint element to sustain casualties they cannot replenish. Yes, posing sacrificing 1/3 of your force. A pause. Mailing 1/3 to a holding action with a known expiration. They don't have to win. They have to last long enough. The math is specific. You need 19 minutes of engagement at the feint point to pull the reserves far enough out of position. And if they don't last 19 minutes, then the calculation was wrong and you adapt. The calculation won't be wrong because you pick the element that can last, the Torkan. In this scenario, they can lock brace and absorb punishment that would flatten any other species. 19 minutes in a fixed position is exactly what their biology is designed for. Sale turned to the Torkan section. Cadet Gren. Is that assessment accurate? A massive Torkan in the 3rd row shifted in his seat, all 4 arms crossed. In a fixed brace, 19 minutes against 3-to-1 fire is within parameters. Yes. Sale entered a note in her file. She moved to the next scenario and directed it at Calder specifically. A convoy defense problem with 9 variables and no clean solution. He answered in 40 seconds. She gave him another. He answered in 20. The room got quieter with each one. After the seminar, Keth, the squad leader from the forge, was waiting by the exit. She fell into step beside him without preamble. Your answer's in there, she said. The feint and loop. The force sacrifice calculation. Those aren't in any sovereignty tactical archive. No. Where did you learn them? Calder thought about it. Where had he learned them? Not at a school. Not from a training program. History books about wars. Fought with swords and horses, with muskets and trenches, tanks and aircraft on a single planet where the enemy was always the same species. and the terrain was always trying to kill both sides. From a world where the first generals had commanded with flags and drums because there was no lattice, no overlay, no shared consciousness. Just a human brain trying to hold the shape of a battle in its head while the battle was trying to kill it. Where we've been fighting each other for 10,000 years, he said. We're very good at it. We don't need augmentation to model a battle. We need a map and someone willing to do the math on who gets hurt. Keth was silent for several steps. Then, in the forge, when you called the ambush, you heard them setting up. Before any of our sensors registered anything, sensors are designed for known threat signatures. I was listening for anything that didn't sound like it belonged. Different problem, different solution. You saved my squad. I was part of your squad. Keth made a sound that his translator rendered as reluctant acknowledgement. She turned down a side corridor without another word. But Calder noticed that the next time squad assignments went up, name was listed next to a request. Assign Cadet Mace to Squad 9. It was denied. The proctors had other plans for him by then, but the quest itself was data. Someone had recalculated. Later that day, 2 more Vethray cadets intercepted him in the corridor. They stood in his path, close, using their height, the way their species used everything, as architecture. Your answers in the seminar, one said. They're not doctrine. No. Where do they come from? Calder looked up at them. They come from a species that spent 2 million years fighting things bigger, faster, and stronger than us, and won every time. Not because we were better. Because we were more willing to do the math on who dies and then follow through. They moved aside. He walked on. Day 6 brought the endurance trial. The Skolum called it the corridor, a sealed tunnel 3 kilometers long, environmentally regulated to cycle through 5 different hostile conditions in sequence. Arctic cold for the first 600 meters, the air dropping to -30, and the floor glazing with ice. Then a transition zone where the temperature spiked to 45 degrees in under seconds, the air thick with mineral vapor that clogged non-human respiratory membranes. Then a flooded section, waist-deep in coolant runoff, the current strong enough to push a Celerin off their feet. Then a low-oxygen zone where the atmospheric mix dropped to 14%. The final stretch was full gravity at 1.8 standard, a crushing weight that compressed spines and burst capillaries in species without reinforced vascular systems. The passing standard was completion within 90 minutes. No aids, no augmentation assist, no stopping. If you stopped, a drone hovering behind you tagged you with a stun's pulse and you were carried out. 43 cadets entered, 29 came out. Calder came out in 68 minutes. Not the fastest. The Kasori endured through raw biological stubbornness. 2 Torkon cadets simply locked their joints and walked through the gravity section, like animated statues. Calder was the only cadet who completed every section without slowing below a steady jog. In the cold section, he controlled his breathing and let his body shiver. An involuntary thermoregulation response unique to warm-blooded persistence predators. The shaking burning calories to generate heat. In the heat section, he sweated. In the flooded section, he swam. A skill so alien to the sovereignty that 3 proctors pulled up his species file mid-trial to verify that humans could actually propel themselves through liquid using only their limbs. In the low-oxygen section, he slowed his breathing, dropped his heart rate, and walked at a pace that would have looked lazy if you didn't understand that he was rationing every molecule of air with the precision of a species whose ancestors had hunted at altitudes where the atmosphere was thinner than this. In the gravity section, he bled, his nose, his ears, capillaries rupturing under the load. He kept walking. Blood ran down his chin and dripped onto his chest, and he kept walking, because on Earth, the first humans had carried carcasses across savannas under a sun that could kill them, with broken bones and infected wounds, and they had kept walking, because walking was what humans did when everything else had been stripped away. The offer document 14 trace indicators that would have constituted an emergency in any other species. Calder declined treatment, ate 2 protein blocks, and asked when the next exercise was scheduled. Draven marked his file again. The escalation protocol field was getting crowded. The physical training beyond the corridor was harder than the mental work, and the gap was cruel. The Sokolum's standard course was calibrated for species with reinforced skeletons, secondary respiratory systems, and redundant cardiovascular loops. Calder had none of that. They increased the gravity in the training hall to 1.5 standard on day 7. 2 Vethrai cadets dropped out with joint compression injuries. Acelerin collapsed and had to be carried off the course. Kesori ground through it on raw mass, their plated legs absorbing the load like living pylons. Calder finished last, dead last. His vision was tunneling by the end, and his legs had stopped sending clear signals to his brain. But he finished. He crossed the line under his own power, declined the stretcher the medical team offered, and walked to the refectory on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He couldn't feel his feet for 4 hours. He used the time to review the Skolum's structural schematics from memory, tracing corridors in his mind like a cartographer drawing a map of enemy territory. The Sholem was built to test everything that entered it, and the terrain itself was part of the test. On day 7, after the gravity course, they ran a weapons qualification module, standard sovereignty arms, pulse carbines, plasma sidearms, concussive launchers, each calibrated for species with different grip strengths, targeting systems, and recoil tolerances. Calder's hands were too small for the standard grips on every weapon except the sidearm, and even that required the thermal pad wrapping he'd jury-rigged on his first night. But the qualifications wasn't about the weapons. It was about target acquisition, threat prioritization, and engagement sequencing, the cognitive architecture behind pulling the trigger. Targets appeared in randomized patterns: hostile, civilian, structural, decoy. Cadets had to identify, prioritize, and engage in the correct order within shrinking time windows. The lattice-linked Vethrai excelled. Their shared consciousness let them distribute the cognitive load across the squad, each cadet processing a sector, while the lattice integrated the whole picture. A squad of 5 Vethrai effectively had 5 brains working as one. Calder had 1 brain, but it was a brain that had evolved to track multiple moving objects simultaneously, a survival requirement on a planet where predators attacked from multiple directions, and the prey you were chasing might lead you past the territorial boundary of something worse. He didn't process targets sequentially, the way the sovereignty's targeting doctrine taught. He processed them in parallel, the way a human processes a room full of strangers and identifies the 3 who are dangerous before the conscious mind has finished naming them. His qualification scores were 3rd highest in the cohort, behind 2 Vethrai lattice-linked squads, ahead of every individual cadet from every species. Proctor Drevin looked at the scores for a long time. He didn't say anything. He entered something in the escalation protocol field and moved on. That night, Calder found his bunk had been moved closer to the door. Better sight lines, easier exit. The mattress thermal pad had been recalibrated to 22 degrees. Human comfort range. Someone was paying attention. On day 8, him in the sparring ring against Tor Dakin. Standard rules: unarmed, full contact, submission or incapacitation. The ring was a circle of hard composite 10 meters across, watched by 2 proctors and the full cadre of Tier 0 cadets. Dakin outweighed him by 90 kilograms. His reach was twice Calder's. The match was a biological absurdity. It lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Calder had spent the first 3 minutes and 40 seconds doing nothing but moving, not retreating, moving, circling, shifting angles, changing tempo. On a forest world, Tor Dakin species were ambush predators. Explosive power, short engagement, overwhelming force. They didn't chase, they struck. Calder made him chase, and chase and chase. By the 3-minute mark, Tor Dakin's plates were cycling rapidly, an autonomic stress response. He was burning energy faster than he could replenish it. His strikes were slowing, his footwork was degrading. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Tor Dakin committed to a lunging grapple. Calder stepped inside it, not away, into it, dropped his center of gravity below the Kesori's reach, and drove his shoulder into the nerve cluster at the base of Tor Dakin's ribcage, where the subdermal plates were thinnest. Not a powerful strike, precise one. The nerve cluster seized, and for 1 second the Kesori's right side went slack. Calder hooked his leg, shifted his weight, and redirected 90 kilograms of armored predator into the floor. The composite cracked under the impact. He stepped back, Dakin was on the ground, breathing hard, his plates locked in full defensive mode. An involuntary response his species couldn't override. He wasn't unconscious. He wasn't injured. He was neutralized. The proctor called the match. Calder offered Dakin his hand. Kisori stared at it for a long time, then took it and let the human pull him to his feet. How? Dakin said. Species is built to end fights fast. Mine is built to make them last. I just waited until the math was on my side. The room stayed quiet as Calder walked off the ring. Not silent quiet. Quiet was calculation. The proctors noted the crack in the composite floor. They noted it as data. That evening, 3 things happened that told Calder the Sholem's assessment of him had shifted. First, his ration allocation changed. Instead of the standard protein block, his tray held a modified nutrient pack, higher glucose content, adjusted mineral balance. Someone had researched human metabolism. Someone was investing in keeping him functional, rather than waiting for him to fail. Second, Dakin sat with him at dinner again. You could have broken my ribs, Dakin said. I could have. But the point was the match, the injury. In the Kisori military tradition, the victor breaks something, a plate, a finger. Something that heals, but something that reminds. In mine you help them up. Dakin's plates rippled. Not a threat display this time. Something slower, more deliberate. Processing. Species confuses me. We confuse ourselves. It's part of the system. Third, when Calder returned to Barracks 9, he found that someone had adjusted his door control to a height he could reach without jumping. No note, no explanation. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he went inside and memorized the next day's course layout. On day 9, Dr. Drevin ran a navigation exercise. Cadets were given encrypted coordinates, a compass analog, and 8 hours to reach a checkpoint in the wilderness zone. A vast, artificially maintained ecosystem on the Sholem's western flank, 40 square kilometers of engineered terrain that replicated conditions from a dozen different worlds. Dense forest, open rock fields, river systems, faces. No tactical overlays, no lattice assistance, no maps. Raw navigation the way pre-spaceflight species had done it, by reading the land. Most cadets were lost within the first hour. The Vethrae, deprived of their lattice feeds, moved in tight groups and navigated by committee, arguing over bearings. The Kisori relied on scent trails and ground vibration, skills their forest world ancestors had honed, but that the artificial ecosystem's unfamiliar biome confused. The Torkon simply picked a direction and walked, trusting that their endurance would carry them to the right place eventually. Calder navigated by the sun, or rather by the artificial light source that replicated the system's primary star. He tracked its arc, calculated his bearing, cross-referenced with terrain features. The slope of drainage channels indicated downhill toward water. Water flowed toward collection points. Collection points were engineered features that appeared on structural plans he'd memorized from the corridor, schematics board 6 days earlier. He reached the checkpoint in 3 hours and 41 minutes. First in the cohort, he was sitting on a rock when the next cadet arrived 47 minutes later. How did you get here? I read the ground. The ground doesn't have data. It has water, slope, and soil composition. You only need 2 data points to navigate. 8 cadets never arrived. The escalation protocol field was now a full paragraph. In the combat simulations, they stopped putting him in squads after day 9. Proctors wanted to see what he did alone. They dropped him into scenarios designed for 3 cadet fire teams and watched him dismantle them with movement patterns the tactical AI couldn't predict. Not because they were brilliant, because they were alien to every model the sovereignty had built. He read terrain the way a persistence hunter read a landscape, not as a map of positions, but as a story of movement, a narrative of where things had been, where they were going, and where they would be when he arrived. The AI kept logging his tactics as anomalous. After the 3rd solo scenario, Drevin pulled the AI's classification report and read it aloud to the other proctors. Under tactical methodology, the system had generated a category it had never used before. Unmodeled, not wrong, not suboptimal, unmodeled. The system couldn't classify what Calder was doing because nothing in 300 years of sovereignty military doctrine had prepared it for a species that fought like this. The proctors argued over what to do. His presence was distorting the cohort. Other cadets were abandoning standard doctrine to try to predict his movements, and the standard doctrine existed for a reason. Drevin settled it. Send him to sail. Let command decide. On day 10, Commandant Seal summoned him to her office. Austere, undecorated, lit by the same violet light. She sat behind a desk with nothing on it except a data tablet and a drinking vessel that steamed faintly. Sit. Calder sat. The chair was too large for him. Your physical scores are in the bottom 8% of the cohort. Tactical aptitude is in the top 1%. Your combat simulation efficiency is the highest recorded this cycle. By a factor of 3, no cadet has ever exhibited a performance disparity this extreme. I'm working with what I have. What you have is a body that should not survive this institution, and a mind that operates outside every tactical model we've built. Decision latency is shorter than cadets, with neural lattice augmentation. It's not faster, it's different. Your systems model scenarios. I read rooms. I walk into a room and I feel where the threat is, where the weak point is, where the fight is going to happen before it starts. Pursuit predators. We don't outrun prey. We outlast it and outthink it. It's not augmentation. It's 2 million years of killing things, smarter and faster and stronger than us. By being better at reading the moment. Sale set down her drinking vessel. The Crucible. Tor Dawkin mentioned it. The command staff has recommended you be advanced to the Crucible, not as a reward, as an assessment. Your performance is disrupting the cohort's training equilibrium. Crucible will determine whether your methods represent something the sovereignty needs to account for. When? Tomorrow. What's the objective? You'll be briefed at 0400. No cadet in STIS of standard training has completed the Crucible on their first attempt. You've had 14 days, then I'll have to be efficient. Seal studied him. Your species file says you're Category 6, moderate threat. Is it wrong? Calder looked at her, at the rank scars on her temples, at the career officer who had fought wars and trained killers, and was now sitting across from a 17-year-old mammal asking a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. We're cooperative, he said. That doesn't mean we're moderate. The Crucible began at 0400 the next morning. They woke him at 0330. 2 proctors, armed. The briefing happened while he dressed. Reach a designated extraction point 7 kilometers through the Skolum's deep structure within 6 hours. The deep structure was the old training complex built into the bedrock, used for advanced scenarios requiring real environmental hazards, terrain, lip threat, combat drones operating at full lethality, not reduced, kill grade. They gave him a sidearm, survival kit the size of his fist, and 30 seconds of lead time before the first drone activated. The deep structure was dark, cold, and architecturally hostile. Corridors that narrowed to crawl spaces, chambers that vented to vacuum on randomized timers, shafts that dropped 30 meters with no railing. The temperature cycled between extremes. The air tasted like iron and old stone. Calder moved through it the way his ancestors had moved through terrain for 100,000 years. Quietly, patiently, reading the ground, the air movement, the temperature gradients. He didn't rush. The 6-hour window was a psychological pressure lever, designed to make him panic. He'd learned that the predator chasing you wants you to run. Running means you've stopped thinking. The first drone found him 40 minutes in. It was a sphere the size of his fist, armored, fast, armed with a focused kinetic projector that could punch through a Kasori's chest plate at 20 meters. It came around a corner on near-silent thrusters, sensor array sweeping the corridor in methodical arcs. Calder was already below its scan line. He'd heard the displacement of air 30 seconds before it appeared. A faint pressure change, barely perceptible, the kind of signal you noticed when you'd grown up on a world where the whisper of grass could mean a snake or a lion. Pressed himself flat against the base of the wall, below the drone's minimum scan angle. A design constraint, because no sovereignty species was small enough to fit in that gap. He let it pass overhead, then he stood up behind it and put a single shot through the seam between its thruster housing and its sensor array. The drone dropped. He stripped its power cell in 12 seconds. Fingernails and leverage, the way his species had been prying things apart since the first stone tool, and kept moving. The second drone was smarter, or at least differently programmed. It came from below, rising through a shaft he'd marked as a dead end on his mental map. He heard it 4 seconds before it crested the shaft opening. The change in air pressure, the whine of thrusters compressing into a vertical climb. He didn't have time to drop below the scan line. Instead, he did something the drone's targeting algorithm wasn't programmed to expect. He threw his empty sidearm holster at it. The holster was leather analog, soft, with no kinetic signature worth targeting. The drone's sensor array tracked it, identified it as non-threat, and dismissed it in a 0.3 seconds. But 0.3 seconds was long enough for Calder to close the distance. He grabbed the drone's thruster housing barehanded. The surface was hot enough to blister, and his palm screamed, and jammed his thumb into the sensor array's maintenance port. A human thumb, exactly the right size and shape to depress the emergency shutdown contact that the drone's designers had put there for maintenance crews to use with specialized tools. The drone powered down. His thumb was burned. He wrapped it and kept moving. By hour 2, he had disabled 4 drones and scavenged their power cells. He wired 3 in series to boost his sidearm's output. Jury-rigged field modification, the kind of improvisation that violated every equipment regulation in the Skolom's manual. It also tripled his effective range and doubled the penetration on the remaining drone armor types. The 4th power cell he cracked open and used the chemical reactant inside to etch marks on the corridor walls. A navigation system, invisible to drone sensors but legible to human eyes in low light. By hour 3, he'd reached the geothermal zone. 52 degrees, air thick with mineral vapor. He soaked his undershirt in condensation from a coolant pipe, wrapped it around his head, and let evaporative cooling do what 2 million years of savanna evolution had designed it to do. Sovereignty species didn't sweat. They panted, or they overheated and shut down. Calder sweated, and his core temperature held, and he kept moving. The deep structure's layout had been changing around him. The Skolom's environmental AI was modifying the terrain in real time, channeling him toward kill zones. It was learning from him. So he taught it the wrong lessons. He moved in patterns designed to mislead, doubling back, taking inefficient routes, pausing in positions that suggested indecision or fatigue. He left his chemical etch marks in patterns that implied he was mapping the upper corridors systematically, heading for the most direct route to the extraction point. He even fired his sidearm twice into empty chambers, the sound echoing through the deep structure's acoustic channels, telling the AI exactly where he was. Except he wasn't there. The shots were angled off reflective surfaces, a trick that required understanding the stone's acoustic properties, required understanding stone, which required being from a planet where stone had been the first weapon, the first shelter, and the first tool your species ever used. The system responded by opening corridors toward the extraction point along the upper route, deploying its remaining drones to cover the approach it expected. It was optimizing against a model of Calder that he had built for it. A false model, a decoy made of sound and marks and deliberate inefficiency. He wasn't on his most likely path. He was 2 levels below it, moving through a maintenance conduit that didn't appear on any current schematic. He'd found it by reading the walls, stone worn smooth in a track pattern that meant heavy equipment had been dragged through here decades ago, before the deep structure was repurposed. Wherever heavy equipment went, there was a path wide enough for a human, too narrow for a Torkon, too low for a Vethrai, built for machines passable by the smallest sentient species the Sholem had ever enrolled. At hour 4, he encountered the final obstacle. A chamber, 20 meters across, circular, carved from raw bedrock. The extraction beacon pulsed blue-white at its center. Between him and the beacon, 3 combat drones in a triangulated field of fire that covered every square meter. No cover, no blind spots. He sat in the conduit opening above the chamber and studied it for 8 minutes. Counted the drone's scan cycles. Timed their rotation patterns. 2 seconds per sweep. Staggered so the gaps between coverage never exceeded 0.6 seconds. Mapped the chamber's geometry. The angle of the walls, the height of the ceiling, the reflective coefficient of the bedrock surface, the resonant frequency of the space. Then he pulled the remaining power cells from the disabled drones, wired them to the first drone's thruster housing, built an improvised directional explosive, shaped charge, focused blast wave. The kind of weapon a human would assemble from salvage in a hostile environment, with 6 minutes of lead time and the steady certainty that if the physics was wrong, the next thing he felt would be nothing at all. The physics wasn't wrong. He triggered the device and dropped it through the conduit opening. The detonation was contained. A shaped concussive wall that swept across the chamber floor at knee height, below the drone's armor profile, striking them at the structural joint between thruster housing and ventral sensor array. 2 drones went down instantly, their systems overwhelmed by the shock wave. The third was damaged but operational, spinning to reacquire the threat source. Calder dropped from the conduit before it completed its rotation, hit the floor in a controlled roll, came up with his boosted sidearm, a single shot through the drone's cracked sensor housing from 4 meters. Silence. He walked to the beacon and set his palm against the activation panel. 4 hours, 23 minutes, solo, no support, no augmentation, 14 days of training. The record for the Crucible was 8 hours, 41 minutes, set by a Torcon cadet with 2 years of preparation and a full combat loadout. Calder had halved it with a sidearm, stolen parts, a burned thumb, the quiet, relentless refusal to let an institution built for species, larger, stronger, and harder than him decide what he was capable of. The extraction team found him sitting cross-legged beside the beacon. The team leader, a Vethrai combat medic, scanned him, cataloged 3 burns, 2 lacerations, a cracked rib he hadn't noticed, and a core temperature at the edge of thermal stress. "You need the medical bay," she said. "I need a shower and a protein pack. The rib will set on its own. Don't set on their own in any species I've treated. In mine they do. We're built for damage, not to avoid it, to recover from it. It's a feature." She entered something in her medical log. Endurance recovery capacity consistent with apex persistence, predator physiology. Recommend inclusion in species assessment review. "That's what happened," he said. The Vethrai officer across the table had not moved during the entire account. The tablet between them still pulsed its amber recording light. The violet light still made his skin look like something already dead. But he was very much alive, and she knew it. The knowledge sat between them like a weight. "The Dean's reclassification request," she said. "Category 2, Strategic Apex Predator. I saw it. Quest cites your Crucible performance, your simulation record, your sparring result, and a note from Commandant Sale." She consulted the tablet. "The subject operates outside the boundaries of every tactical model the Sholom has developed over 3 centuries. His methods are a fundamentally different approach to threat, terrain, and adversary, in evolutionary adaptations the sovereignty has not previously encountered. I recommend Category 2 without reservation." Calder waited. Committee is divided. Several members believe the reclassification is an overreaction to a single exceptional individual. Others note that you are, by your own account, not exceptional among your species. I'm not. I'm a 17-year-old with no augmentation, no combat experience outside a training environment, and a skeleton that cracks under gravity your species considers mild. The things that let me do it, the pattern recognition, the persistence predator endurance, the ability to improvise under lethal pressure, those aren't mine. Those are human. You're not reclassifying me. You're reclassifying 8 billion of me. The officer's writing hand stopped moving. 8 billion. And we've been building this skill set since before we had language, since before we had fire. Not because we're special, because our planet didn't give us a choice. She closed the tablet's cover with a deliberate motion. "The command staff has extended an offer. Full combat certification track, effective immediately. You skip the remaining 2 years of standard training." She paused. "There is a condition. The Sholom wants to study how you train. Not to replicate your methods. They've determined those are species-specific. They want to understand them well enough to develop counter-doctrine. You would be teaching the sovereignty how to fight humans by showing them how a human fights." Calder understood what she was asking. They wanted him to be a weapon and a warning at the same time. Calder had been standing at edges since he arrived. The thing they couldn't model was the willingness to step forward. Not because the fall wasn't real, because standing still was the one thing 2 million years of evolution had never taught his species to do. "I'll do it," he said. But I have a condition of my own. State it. When you develop your counter-doctrine, when you think you've figured out how to beat a human, you test it against me first. Live conditions, full lethality. The officer's 3 pupils spread wide, the Vethray equivalent of a flinch. You want us to use our counter-doctrine against you. I want to know if it works. If it does, you've earned it. If it doesn't. He leaned back in the chair, and for the first time in the entire debrief, something settled across his face that was almost a smile. Then you go back to the drawing board. And I keep teaching. Courting light pulsed once, twice, and went dark. Commandant Sale was waiting in the corridor outside. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, but something in her bearing had shifted. A fractional loosening of the rigid military architecture, visible only if you were the kind of species that read posture the way others read data feeds. The committee approved Category 2, she said. Effective immediately. The sovereignty's files on humanity will be updated across all military and diplomatic databases within the standard cycle, Calder nodded. And the certification? Advanced Combat Track, Tier 1. You report at 0600 tomorrow, she paused. Tier 1 has never had a cadet under 22. You will be the youngest by 5 years and the only human by the margin of your entire species. I've been the only human since I got here. Another tier doesn't change that. No. But the cadets in Tier 1 survived the crucible through years of preparation and the full resources of the Sholom. They will not be impressed by your record. They will be threatened by it. Good. Sale's 3 pupils aligned on him. Good. I don't need impressed. I need sharp. Threatened cadets push harder. Cadets who push harder get better. That's what the Skolom wants. Seal studied him for a moment longer. Then she inclined her head, not a bow, not a nod, something between and older than both. A gesture from the Vethrai military tradition that he wouldn't learn the meaning of until later. The acknowledgement a commander gives to an adversary they have decided to take seriously. 0600 Cadet Mace. He walked back to Barracks 9 through corridors that were familiar now. Every sightline mapped, every choke point catalogued, every structural weakness logged in a memory that never stopped working. He passed cadets who had ignored him 2 weeks ago, and now tracked him with their eyes as he moved by. A Celerin stepped aside to let him pass. Not out of fear, out of something closer to acknowledgement. A Torkan cadet he didn't recognize inclined his head in the same gesture Sale had used, and Calder filed it away to learn about later. He passed the sparring ring where the composite floor still showed the crack from Tor Dakin's impact. Nobody had repaired it. He suspected nobody would. In a place like the Sholom, a crack in the floor was a lesson, and lessons were the only currency that mattered. He passed the refectory, where he'd learned to soak his protein blocks, and where Tor Dakin had sat with him, and tried to understand a species that helped its opponents up after beating them. He passed the orientation hall where he'd sat with his boots 6 inches off the floor and listened to Commandant Louvel tell him he wasn't accommodated for. He passed the medical bay where the officer was updating files. His files, probably, adding another entry to a record that was becoming less of a medical chart and more of a case study in what happened when a Deathworld species was dropped into a system built to break anything below the standard. And the Deathworld species treated the standard as a floor instead of a ceiling. The Skolom hadn't changed. Same violet light, same too large architecture. Calder understood now that the institution was a question. The same question it had asked every cadet for 300 years. What are you when everything is taken away? The answer, for most species, was whatever their augmentations and their biology made them. Strip the lattice from a Vethrai, the plating from a Kisori, the joint lock from a Torkon, and what remained was diminished, reduced. Everything from a human, and what remained was the human. Unaugmented, unarmored, unreduced. Still reading the room, still doing the math, still moving, still refusing to stop. That was the answer the Skolom didn't have a category for. Not the tactics, not the endurance, not the improvised explosives or the stolen power cells or the ability to triangulate position by ear in a dark corridor. Those were applications. The answer underneath them. The thing that drove a 17-year-old with stress fractures and a calcium skeleton to walk into a live fire kill, course after 14 days, and walk out faster than anyone had in 3 centuries. was simpler and older, and more dangerous than any weapon in the Fratern's arsenal. He wanted to be here, not because it was safe, or sane, or survivable, because it was hard. The standard was higher than anything designed for his species. Because every instructor, every proctor, every system, every cadet in the Skolum had looked at him and calculated that he would fail. And he had felt that calculations settle over him like gravity, and he had done what humans always did with gravity. He had pushed against it, and he had stood up. Calder reached Barracks 9, sat on his bunk, pulled off his boots. His body was a catalog of minor damage that any medical officer in the Sovereignty would have flagged, and that any human would have called a slow Tuesday. He looked at the door control. The one someone had lowered 12 centimeters without explanation. A small adjustment, a quiet acknowledgement that he was here and he was staying, and the institution was beginning to accommodate what it couldn't eliminate. He set his alarm for 0530 and lay back on the too large bunk, and the determination that had carried him through every corridor, every exercise, every moment of the past 14 days settled into his bones, like something that had always been there. Because it had. Since the first ancestor who stood upright on a savanna full of predators and decided that being small and soft and breakable was not the same thing as being weak, 2 million years of it bred into the marrow, the quiet, unglamorous, inexhaustible refusal to accept the calculation that said he should be dead, and tomorrow, the same as every day, he would get up, walk into a room full of beings stronger and faster and harder than him, meet their eyes and do the work, and he would not stop.